My name is Jessica Martinez, and at 28 years old, I never thought my own family would steal my life savings and leave me devastated. For 4 years, I worked double shifts as a pediatric nurse, skipping vacations and living on ramen noodles, all to save $67,000 for my dream home in Tempe. But when I checked my account 3 days before closing, every penny was gone. My stepfather had transferred it all to pay for my stepsister's extravagant wedding, claiming it was a family emergency. What I discovered next would land him in federal prison and teach me that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly through the windows of our Scottsdale home as I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at my laptop screen in complete disbelief. The number staring back at me wasn't a mistake or a technical glitch. My savings account, which had held $67,142 just 3 days earlier, now showed a balance of $23.47. 4 years of sacrifice, 4 years of choosing canned soup over restaurant meals, 4 years of driving my beat-up Honda instead of buying something reliable, all gone in a single transaction. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the transaction history, hoping against hope that this was some kind of banking error. But there it was, clear as day, a wire transfer for $67,118.53 to Desert Oaks Country Club, authorized by Robert Chen, my stepfather. The man who had promised to remove himself from my account years ago. The man who claimed he only kept access for emergencies. I had moved back home 6 months earlier, a decision I now realized was the biggest mistake of my life. After my roommate Emma got married and moved to Seattle, I couldn't afford our downtown Phoenix loft on my own. Mom had insisted it would be temporary, just until I could buy my own place. She painted it as a wonderful opportunity for family bonding, a chance to save money while I searched for the perfect home. What she didn't mention was that it would also give Bob unlimited access to monitor and control every aspect of my financial life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was supposed to sign the papers for my dream house in exactly 18 hours. The little craftsman home in Tempe, with its original hardwood floors and the garden where I planned to grow vegetables, was finally within reach. The seller had already accepted my offer, the inspection was complete, and I had spent weeks imagining myself painting the front door a cheerful yellow. Now, thanks to my stepfather's betrayal, that dream was crumbling before my eyes. Bob Chen had entered our lives when I was 20, a successful contractor who swept my recently divorced mother off her feet with his financial stability and take-charge attitude. Linda Martinez had been struggling as a single mother working as a school administrator, and Bob's arrival seemed like a blessing. He paid off her credit card debt, bought her a new car, and moved us into his sprawling Scottsdale home with the pool and 3-car garage. For my mother, it felt like winning the lottery. But from the beginning, I sensed something calculating about Bob's generosity. Every kindness came with strings attached, every gift was mentioned repeatedly as evidence of his dedication to our family. When he insisted on adding his name to my savings account, claiming it was for my protection in case of emergencies, I was too young and naive to understand the implications. He convinced my mother it was responsible parenting, a way to help guide my financial decisions as I transitioned into adulthood. Ashley, Bob's daughter from his first marriage, was 3 years younger than me but had never worked a day in her life. She spent her time shopping with friends, planning elaborate social media posts, and dating a rotating series of men who could fund her expensive tastes. When she announced her engagement to Tyler Brooks, a pharmaceutical sales rep with more ambition than sense, the wedding planning began immediately. Nothing was too good for Ashley's special day, no expense too frivolous for Daddy's little princess. The engagement party alone cost more than most people's entire weddings. Bob rented out Desert Oaks Country Club, hired a string quartet, and flew in flowers from Ecuador. Ashley's engagement ring, a gaudy 3-carat monstrosity that she flashed at every opportunity, cost more than I made in 6 months of saving lives in the pediatric ward. But according to Bob, this was what family did for each other. This was love in action. As a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, I witnessed real love every day. I saw parents sleeping in uncomfortable chairs night after night to stay with sick children. I watched families sacrifice everything to pay for treatments that might save their child's life. I understood the difference between love that demanded sacrifice and love that required it. What Bob practiced was the former, a twisted version of affection that always came with a price tag and an expectation of gratitude. My colleagues often commented on my work ethic, the way I volunteered for every overtime shift and picked up extra responsibilities without complaint. What they didn't know was that every additional hour worked brought me closer to financial independence, closer to escape from a house where my worth was constantly questioned and my goals dismissed as selfish. While Ashley planned her dream wedding with unlimited funds, I was calculating how many years it would take to save enough for a down payment on a modest home. The house in Tempe represented more than just a place to live. It was proof that I could build something meaningful through my own efforts, that I didn't need to depend on someone else's version of generosity. The neighborhood was full of young professionals and small families, people who understood that success came from hard work rather than manipulation. I had already picked out paint colors for each room and researched the best spots to plant tomatoes in the backyard. Bob's construction company, Chen Development, had been thriving for years, landing major contracts throughout the Phoenix metro area. He drove a new Mercedes, wore expensive watches, and frequently bragged about his business acumen at family dinners. According to him, success was simply a matter of being smarter and working harder than everyone else. He had little patience for people who struggled financially, viewing their problems as character flaws rather than circumstances. When Ashley's wedding planning began in earnest, the house became a constant whirlwind of activity. Wedding planners trooped through our living room with fabric samples and catering menus. Ashley's friends gathered around the dining room table, addressing invitations with calligraphy pens while debating the merits of different flower arrangements. The wedding had somehow grown from a simple ceremony to a 3-day extravaganza that would accommodate 300 guests. Every conversation seemed to revolve around wedding details, from the custom-designed wedding dress that required multiple fittings to the imported champagne that would be served at the reception. Bob encouraged every excess, treating each expensive addition as evidence of his love for his daughter. When Ashley decided she needed a horse-drawn carriage for her entrance, Bob simply smiled and reached for his checkbook. When she insisted on flying her sorority sisters in from out of state, he booked their hotel rooms without question. Meanwhile, my attempts to discuss my house purchase were met with polite disinterest or gentle discouragement. Bob questioned whether I was ready for such a big responsibility, whether a young woman living alone was safe in today's world. He suggested I might be happier staying at home a little.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Longer, contributing to the family while building my savings more slowly. His concern felt suffocating rather than caring, motivated by control rather than genuine worry for my well-being. The morning I discovered the theft, I had planned to call my real estate agent with final confirmation that I was ready to proceed with the closing. I had taken the day off work, something I rarely did, to handle last-minute paperwork and prepare for the biggest purchase of my life. Instead, I found myself sitting in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. My first instinct was to assume there had been some kind of mistake. Perhaps Bob had moved the money to a different account for some financial reason I didn't understand. Maybe he was planning some kind of surprise, though I couldn't imagine what that might be. I called the bank immediately, explaining the situation to a customer service representative who sounded increasingly uncomfortable as I described the unauthorized transfer. According to the bank records, Bob had initiated the wire transfer using his legitimate access to the account. From their perspective, this was a routine transaction between authorized account holders. The fact that he had stolen my life savings was a family matter, not a banking issue. They suggested I speak with him directly to resolve any misunderstanding, advice that felt like salt in an open wound. I found Bob in his home office, reviewing construction blueprints with his usual air of focused concentration. When I knocked on the door, he looked up with mild annoyance, as if I were interrupting something far more important than my financial devastation. His desk was covered with wedding-related receipts and invoices, evidence of the spending spree that had apparently consumed my savings along with his own money. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "About my savings account." Bob leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, that. I was wondering when you'd notice." "Don't worry, Jess, it's all for a good cause. Ashley's wedding is next weekend, and we had some unexpected expenses come up." The casual way he dismissed my life's work was breathtaking. 4 years of sacrifice reduced to an unexpected expense, my dreams treated as a minor inconvenience in his daughter's fairy tale celebration. I struggled to find words that could adequately express the depth of his betrayal without descending into screaming. That was my money, Bob. My savings for my house. I'm supposed to close tomorrow. I know it seems like a lot right now, he continued, his tone patronizing and calm, but think about it from a family perspective. Ashley only gets married once, hopefully, and this is her chance to have the wedding of her dreams. You're young, you'll have plenty of time to save again. But we can't recreate this moment if we don't do it right the first time. The logic was so twisted, so fundamentally selfish, that I felt my worldview shifting in real time. This wasn't a man who had made a desperate decision in a moment of crisis. This was someone who genuinely believed that my goals were less important than his daughter's wants, that my years of hard work were acceptable collateral damage in his quest to play the generous father. I trusted you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. When you said you needed to stay on the account for emergencies, I trusted you. And this is an emergency, Bob replied, spreading his hands as if the logic were obvious. The caterer needed final payment, the florist required cash up front, and there were some last-minute additions that Ashley really wanted. I couldn't disappoint her, not when I had access to funds that could make her day perfect. The word funds hit me like a physical blow. My savings had been reduced to funds, impersonal resources that existed for his convenience, rather than the result of years of careful planning and sacrifice. Every double shift I had worked, every vacation I had skipped, every small pleasure I had denied myself, all dismissed as if they had never happened. You stole from me, I said, the words hanging in the air between us like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Bob's expression hardened, the mask of reasonable explanation slipping to reveal something colder underneath. I didn't steal anything, Jessica. That account has my name on it, which makes this a family financial decision. If you can't understand that we sometimes have to make sacrifices for each other, then maybe you're not as mature as I thought. The gaslighting was expert and immediate, designed to make me question my own perception of reality. But 4 years of financial independence had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct was screaming that this was theft, pure and simple. The fact that his name was on the account didn't give him the moral right to destroy my future for his daughter's entertainment. I left his office without another word, knowing that further argument would be pointless. Bob had already decided that his actions were justified, and no amount of reasoning would change his mind. Instead, I needed to figure out how to protect myself and potentially recover what had been stolen. The house in Tempe would have to wait, but my future didn't have to be destroyed by one man's selfishness. That evening, as wedding preparations continued around me with renewed intensity, I began researching my options. The internet was full of stories about financial elder abuse and family theft, but most of the advice seemed designed for situations involving elderly victims and clearly criminal behavior. My situation felt more complicated, mired in the gray area between legal technicalities and moral violations. The next morning, I called my real estate agent to explain that I couldn't proceed with the closing. Sarah Henderson had been incredibly patient throughout the buying process, and breaking the news felt like disappointing a friend. She was shocked by my situation but immediately offered to help me explore options for delaying the purchase or finding alternative financing. Unfortunately, without my down payment, no bank would approve me for a mortgage on a nurse's salary. That afternoon, Ashley's bridesmaids arrived for the final dress fitting, filling the house with excited chatter about the upcoming celebration. I watched from my bedroom window, as they posed for photos by the pool, their joy a stark contrast to my devastation. None of them knew that their friend's perfect wedding was being funded by the destruction of someone else's dreams. The Chen household operated like a well-oiled machine designed to serve one purpose: maintaining Bob's image as the successful patriarch who could provide anything his family desired. Every room in our Scottsdale home reflected his taste for expensive displays of wealth, from the imported marble countertops in the kitchen to the crystal chandelier that dominated our dining room. The house itself was a testament to Bob's construction expertise, featuring custom woodwork and architectural details that he never failed to point out to visitors. Bob had built his reputation in Phoenix's competitive construction market through a combination of aggressive bidding and an uncanny ability to secure permits and approvals that other contractors struggled to obtain. Chen Development had grown from a small residential operation to a company that handled major commercial projects throughout Arizona. Bob's office walls were covered with photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and groundbreaking events, evidence of his connections with city officials and business leaders, who seemed eager to work with him. My mother Linda had transformed herself completely since marrying Bob, trading her practical wardrobe for designer clothes and her modest Honda for a luxury SUV. As a school administrator, she had always been respected for her dedication to education and her ability to manage complex budgets. But in Bob's world, her professional accomplishments were rarely mentioned, overshadowed by her role as the perfect wife who could host dinner parties and coordinate social events with effortless grace. Linda's relationship with Bob seemed built on gratitude rather than genuine partnership. She frequently spoke about how lucky she was to have found someone willing to take on a woman with a grown daughter, as if she had been damaged goods that Bob had generously accepted. Her constant expressions of appreciation for his financial support created an atmosphere where questioning his decisions felt like ingratitude rather than reasonable discourse. Ashley had grown up in this environment of unlimited indulgence, never learning to distinguish between wants and needs, because every desire was immediately fulfilled. Her bedroom was a shrine to consumerism, filled with designer handbags, expensive jewelry and clothes with tags still attached. She changed her major 3 times during college, each switch accompanied by new textbooks and supplies that Bob purchased without complaint, treating education like an expensive hobby rather than serious preparation for independence. The dynamic between Ashley and me had always been complicated by our different relationships with money and responsibility. While I worked through college and contributed to household expenses whenever possible, Ashley received a monthly allowance that exceeded many people's salaries. She viewed my work ethic as unnecessary and slightly tragic, unable to understand why I chose to struggle when I could simply ask Bob for whatever I needed. Bob's treatment of Ashley revealed his deep-seated beliefs about gender roles and family hierarchies. He encouraged her dependency, praising her for being feminine and delicate, while subtly criticizing my independence as unwomanly. When Ashley expressed interest in careers, Bob suggested fields that would be suitable for a woman from a good family, steering her away from anything too demanding or competitive. His vision of success for his daughter involved marrying well and maintaining the lifestyle he had provided, not building something of her own. Tyler Brooks had appeared in Ashley's life at exactly the right moment, a pharmaceutical sales representative with enough ambition to impress Bob and enough insecurity to appreciate Ashley's high-maintenance lifestyle. Their relationship moved quickly from dating to engagement, driven partly by genuine affection but mostly by their shared vision of an affluent future built on traditional gender roles. Tyler saw Ashley as a trophy wife, who would enhance his professional image, while Ashley saw him as a continuation of the financial security she had always known. The engagement announcement had been a carefully orchestrated affair, complete with professional photographers and a champagne reception that Bob hosted at the country club. Ashley's ring, a gaudy display of diamonds that caught the light from across the room, became the centerpiece of every conversation she had. She treated the engagement like a business transaction that had been successfully completed, frequently discussing the social and financial advantages of marrying into Tyler's family. Wedding planning consumed the household for months, transforming our home into a command center for coordinating vendors, scheduling appointments, and managing the endless details that Ashley deemed essential for her perfect day. Bob embraced his role as father of the bride with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession, treating each expensive decision as an investment in his daughter's happiness and his own reputation as a generous provider. The guest list grew exponentially as Bob insisted on inviting business associates and their families, turning what had started as an intimate celebration into a networking opportunity disguised as a wedding. He spoke frequently about the importance of making the right impression, of showing the Phoenix business community that Chen development was thriving, and that the Chen family understood how to celebrate in style. My attempts to maintain some distance from the wedding chaos were met with increasing pressure to participate more enthusiastically. Linda suggested that my lack of excitement about Ashley's engagement reflected poorly on my character, implying that jealousy was preventing me from supporting my stepsister during this important time. Bob made pointed comments about family loyalty and the importance of putting aside personal concerns for the greater good of family harmony. The financial arrangements for the wedding revealed the extent to which Bob had positioned himself as the benevolent dictator of our family's resources. He paid for everything without consulting anyone else, making decisions about flowers, music, and catering based on his own preferences rather than genuine collaboration with Ashley. She had learned to frame her desires in terms of what would make him proud, rather than what she actually wanted, manipulating his ego to achieve her goals. As the wedding expenses mounted, I began to worry about the financial strain on the family, though my concerns were dismissed as unnecessary anxiety from someone who didn't understand how successful people managed money. Bob assured everyone that business was booming, and that Ashley's wedding was a worthwhile investment in family happiness. He spoke about money as if it were an unlimited resource that existed primarily to demonstrate love and commitment. The vendors Bob selected for the wedding were uniformly expensive and exclusive, chosen more for their prestige than their actual quality. The florist flew in orchids from Thailand, the caterer specialized in molecular gastronomy that transformed simple ingredients into unrecognizable artistic presentations, and the photographer charged more for one day than many people earned in a month. Each selection was justified as being worthy of Ashley's special day, as if settling for anything less would somehow diminish the significance of her marriage. Bob's behavior during the wedding planning revealed aspects of his personality that I had noticed but never fully understood. His need to control every detail, his inability to accept suggestions from others, and his tendency to view relationships in terms of financial transactions all became more pronounced under the pressure of organizing such an elaborate event. He treated vendors like employees rather than collaborators, expecting immediate compliance with his demands regardless of practicality or cost. The transformation of our house during wedding preparation week was complete and overwhelming. Every available surface was covered with wedding-related items, from centerpiece prototypes to favor bags that needed assembly. Professional coordinators moved through our rooms with military precision, transforming spaces into temporary storage areas for the massive logistical operation that Ashley's wedding had become. Ashley's behavior during this period oscillated between princess-like demands and genuine anxiety about living up to the expectations that had been created around her special day. She had become accustomed to being the center of attention, but the intensity of wedding planning seemed to overwhelm even her considerable capacity for drama. Her mood swings affected the entire household, creating an atmosphere of tension disguised as celebration. Tyler's family had initially been impressed by the scale of wedding preparations, interpreting Bob's lavish spending as evidence of his success and generosity. However, as the expenses continued to escalate beyond anything they had experienced, some of them began to express concern about the financial sustainability of such extravagance. Their polite questions about costs were met with Bob's reassurances that money was no object when it came to his daughter's happiness. The week before the wedding, our house resembled a luxury hotel more than a family home, with professional staff coordinating deliveries and managing the complex timeline of preparation activities. Ashley held court in the living room, surrounded by bridesmaids who had taken time off work to participate in the elaborate pre-wedding celebrations that Bob had organized. The spa day, shopping expedition, and private dining events were all documented extensively for social media, creating a permanent record of the family's wealth and generosity. My own role in these festivities was carefully managed to minimize my visibility, while ensuring I couldn't be accused of not participating. I was included in group photos, but positioned in the background, invited to events but not given any meaningful responsibilities, and consulted about decisions that had already been made. The message was clear: I was family enough to be present but not important enough to have real input. The financial discussions I overheard during this period were revealing in their casualness, about enormous expenses. Bob spoke about tens of thousands of dollars as if they were modest amounts, approving last-minute additions to the wedding, without apparent concern for the total cost. When vendors requested immediate payment for services, he produced cashier's checks with the confidence of someone who had unlimited resources at his disposal. Linda's behavior during wedding week reflected her complete absorption into Bob's worldview about money and family priorities. She coordinated with vendors, managed Ashley's schedule, and supervised the transformation of our home without ever questioning the wisdom of such enormous expenses. Her pride in the elaborate preparations seemed genuine, as if she had internalized Bob's belief that lavish spending was an appropriate expression of family love. The night before the wedding, as I lay in my childhood bedroom, listening to the sounds of final preparations downstairs, I reflected on how completely my family had embraced a lifestyle that prioritized appearance over substance. The house that had become my prison was about to host an event that would cost more than most people's annual salaries, funded partly by the theft of my life savings. The contrast between Ashley's unlimited access to resources and my own careful financial planning represented everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. Despite my anger and disappointment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation about what would happen after the wedding. Bob had spent enormous amounts of money to create Ashley's perfect day, but I wondered whether the financial reality of such extravagance would eventually catch up with him. The construction business that supported our lifestyle was subject to economic fluctuations and competitive pressures that even Bob's connections couldn't completely control. The wedding morning arrived with Arizona sunshine and temperatures that promised to make the outdoor ceremony uncomfortably hot, despite the expensive cooling systems Bob had rented. Ashley's preparation began before dawn, with professional hair and makeup artists transforming our master bedroom into a beauty salon. The house filled with the controlled chaos of getting ready, as bridesmaids, family members, and vendors coordinated their activities around Ashley's timeline. Bob moved through the preparation activities with the satisfaction of a general whose battle plan was proceeding exactly as designed. He checked and rechecked details, coordinated with vendors, and basked in the compliments from guests who were arriving early to help with final preparations. His pride in the elaborate wedding was obvious and genuine, reflecting his deep belief that money well spent on family was the highest expression of love and success. As the morning progressed and wedding guests began arriving,
At Desert Oaks Country Club, I realized that this elaborate celebration would mark not just Ashley's transition to married life, but also my final recognition that my place in this family would always be secondary to Bob's biological daughter. The theft of my savings had been possible precisely because I was considered family enough to contribute but not important enough to consult. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of expensive coordination, with every detail executed flawlessly despite the massive logistical challenges involved. Ashley looked genuinely beautiful in her custom-designed gown, and Tyler seemed appropriately overwhelmed by the magnificence of the celebration that Bob had created. The guests, impressed by the scale and elegance of the event, offered congratulations that reflected their assumption that Chen Development must be extraordinarily successful to support such lavish spending. During the reception, as I watched Bob accept praise for his generosity and Ashley bask in the admiration of 300 guests, I understood that my theft had been more than just a financial crime. It had been a declaration that my dreams were expendable resources in Bob's pursuit of social status and family legacy. The beautiful wedding celebration was built on the destruction of my carefully planned future, a fact that made every smile and congratulation feel like salt in an open wound. The success of Ashley's wedding would become part of family mythology, a story Bob would tell for years about his devotion to his daughter and his ability to provide anything she needed. But for me, the wedding represented the moment I finally understood that staying in this family would require me to accept that my goals and dreams would always be sacrificed for the benefit of others. The elaborate celebration marked not just Ashley's new beginning, but also my recognition that I needed to find a way to escape before Bob's financial manipulations destroyed what remained of my future. Bob's construction empire had been built through a combination of legitimate business success and financial arrangements that existed in the gray areas of industry practice. Chen Development's rapid growth had been fueled partly by Bob's willingness to take on projects that other contractors avoided, either because of their complexity or because of the political connections required to secure necessary approvals. His office was filled with awards and recognition from industry associations, but I had begun to notice that his business relationships seemed unusually dependent on personal favors and informal agreements. The vendors and contractors who worked with Chen Development often spoke about Bob's generosity and his willingness to pay premium prices for quality work, but their comments sometimes carried undertones that suggested their relationships involved more than simple business transactions. Bob's ability to secure permits and approvals that other contractors struggled to obtain had become legendary in Phoenix construction circles, though the specific methods he used to achieve these successes were never discussed openly. During Ashley's wedding reception, I observed Bob's interactions with his business associates and began to understand the extent to which his professional success was intertwined with his social connections. City officials, permit administrators, and other contractors treated him with a deference that seemed disproportionate to his actual business accomplishments. Their conversations were filled with references to shared experiences and mutual obligations that suggested relationships built on more than professional respect. The financial resources that had funded Ashley's elaborate wedding came from business operations that I was beginning to suspect involved practices that might not withstand close examination. Bob's casual attitude toward enormous expenses, his ability to produce large amounts of cash when needed, and his apparent immunity to the economic pressures that affected other construction companies all suggested revenue streams that might be more complex than simple project profits. As the wedding celebration continued into the evening, with guests praising Bob's generosity and Ashley's beauty, I realized that my theft had been funded by money that might itself have been obtained through questionable means. The irony of being robbed by someone whose own wealth might be built on shaky foundations was not lost on me, though it provided little comfort as I watched my life savings being celebrated as evidence of Bob's devotion to family. The morning I discovered the second unauthorized withdrawal from my checking account marked the beginning of my transformation from victim to investigator. Bob had apparently decided that having access to my savings wasn't sufficient for his needs, and had begun helping himself to my monthly salary as well. The $2,800 that disappeared overnight represented my entire paycheck from St. Mary's Hospital, money I needed for basic living expenses, and the slow process of rebuilding what he had already stolen. This latest theft was different from the wedding fund raid because it served no ceremonial purpose that Bob could use to justify his actions. Ashley was already married and honeymooning in Europe, Tyler had been welcomed into the family with appropriate fanfare, and there were no upcoming celebrations that might require my financial contribution. The money had simply vanished into Bob's accounts, leaving me unable to pay for gas, groceries, or any other necessities required for independent survival. My confrontation with Bob about this second theft revealed a man who had convinced himself that my entire financial existence was subject to his oversight and control. When I demanded an explanation for the missing paycheck, he calmly explained that I owed the family money for room and board, expenses that he had generously overlooked during my months of living at home. According to his revised accounting, my previous financial contributions had been insufficient to cover my actual costs, making my salary a reasonable source of back payment. The mathematical creativity required for Bob's justification was breathtaking in its audacity. He produced a handwritten ledger that detailed my supposed debts to the household, including charges for utilities, food, cleaning services, and even a portion of the property taxes on our Scottsdale home. The amounts were clearly fabricated, designed to retroactively justify whatever money he chose to take, but presented with the confidence of someone who expected his authority to override any logical objections. Linda's response to this second theft was even more disappointing than her acceptance of the wedding fund raid. When I showed her Bob's fraudulent ledger and explained how he had stolen my paycheck, she urged me to be more understanding of his financial pressures and more appreciative of everything he had provided for our family. Her suggestion that I should be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to household expenses revealed how completely she had internalized Bob's worldview about money and family obligation. The pediatric ward at St. Mary's Hospital became my sanctuary during this period of financial crisis, the one place where I could focus on meaningful work while temporarily forgetting about my personal problems. My supervisor, Dr. Rodriguez, noticed that I had been working additional shifts and staying late to complete documentation, but attributed my increased dedication to professional ambition rather than financial desperation. The irony that I was working more hours to earn money that Bob would steal before I could spend it was not lost on me. My colleagues began commenting on my changed appearance and demeanor, noting that I looked tired and stressed despite my apparent dedication to work. Several nurses offered to cover my shifts or suggested that I take some time off to rest, advice that I couldn't follow because missing work would mean missing paychecks that I desperately needed, regardless of whether Bob would allow me to keep them. Marcus's growing concern about my situation led to increasingly direct conversations about my need to take action against Bob's financial abuse. His perspective as someone outside my family allowed him to see clearly what I had been conditioned to accept as normal, and his outrage on my behalf helped me understand that Bob's behavior was criminal rather than simply unfair. When Marcus offered to lend me money to escape the situation, I realized that my boyfriend understood the severity of my circumstances better than my own mother.
The legal consultation with Patricia Williams became more urgent as Bob's thefts escalated beyond the original wedding fund to encompass my ongoing income. Patricia explained that the pattern of unauthorized withdrawals was building a stronger case for prosecution, as Bob's actions clearly demonstrated intent to permanently deprive me of money that belonged to me. However, she also warned that Bob's legal access to my accounts would make prosecution complicated and potentially expensive. Patricia's investigation into my situation revealed that financial abuse by family members often escalated over time, with perpetrators becoming increasingly bold about their theft as victims failed to establish boundaries or seek outside help. Bob's progression from taking my savings for a specific purpose to stealing my regular income suggested that he viewed my entire financial existence as subject to his control, a perspective that would likely lead to additional theft if left unchecked. The documentation process that Patricia recommended required me to track every financial transaction, every conversation about money, and every promise Bob made about repayment or restitution. This record-keeping became a daily reminder of how extensively Bob had manipulated our family's financial arrangements to benefit himself while leaving me increasingly vulnerable and dependent. My research into Chen Development's business practices intensified as I began to suspect that Bob's theft was motivated by more than simple entitlement or poor judgment. Public records revealed that several of the company's major projects had experienced significant delays and cost overruns, problems that would have put substantial pressure on cash flow and profitability. The timing of Bob's theft coincided with these business difficulties, suggesting that my money might have been used to address legitimate business expenses rather than personal luxuries. The construction industry connections I had developed through family social events proved useful for gathering information about Chen Development's reputation and financial standing. Conversations with subcontractors and suppliers revealed that Bob had been increasingly slow to pay invoices and had requested extended payment terms that suggested cash flow problems. Several vendors mentioned that they had begun requiring upfront payments or cash deposits before beginning work on Chen Development projects. Bob's relationship with city officials and permit administrators, which had always seemed unusually close, began to take on more sinister implications as I learned more about the construction industry's regulatory environment. The speed with which Chen Development obtained approvals and permits that other contractors struggled to secure suggested relationships that might involve more than simple professional networking. Some of the officials who attended Ashley's wedding had decision-making authority over projects that directly affected Bob's business success. The possibility that Bob's construction business involved corruption or other illegal activities added another layer of complexity to my situation. If Chen Development's success was built on practices that wouldn't withstand legal scrutiny, Bob might be even more desperate to maintain cash flow and avoid attention from law enforcement. My stolen savings might represent a small portion of much larger financial manipulations that could have serious legal consequences if discovered. Ashley's return from her European honeymoon brought temporary distraction from my investigation, as she filled the house with stories about luxury hotels and exclusive restaurants while displaying expensive souvenirs from every city they had visited. Her assumption that I would be interested in detailed descriptions of experiences funded by my stolen money was particularly galling, though I maintained a facade of polite interest to avoid creating family drama that might interfere with my ongoing research. Tyler's integration into the family dynamic revealed additional information about Bob's business practices and financial situation. As a pharmaceutical sales representative, Tyler had experience with corporate expense accounts and business entertainment that gave him insight into Bob's lavish spending patterns. His casual comments about Chen Development's apparent success were mixed with subtle questions about the sustainability of such expensive lifestyle choices, suggesting that he might have noticed inconsistencies in Bob's financial claims. The newlyweds' plans for purchasing their first home provided an opportunity to observe Bob's current financial capacity and willingness to support family members with major purchases. His offer to help with their down payment was less generous than I would have expected, and his suggestions that they consider more modest housing options contradicted his previous encouragement of Ashley's expensive tastes. These changes in Bob's behavior suggested that his financial situation had deteriorated significantly since Ashley's wedding. My investigation into Bob's business practices led me to research the specific projects that Chen Development was currently handling, using public records and industry publications to understand the scope and profitability of the company's work. What I discovered was a pattern of increasingly risky projects that offered high profit margins but also carried substantial potential for cost overruns and delays. Bob's strategy of bidding aggressively on complex projects had initially been successful but was now creating financial pressures that threatened the company's stability. The revelation that several Chen development projects were facing potential litigation from clients or subcontractors added another dimension to my understanding of Bob's financial pressures. Legal disputes in the construction industry could tie up significant amounts of money for extended periods, creating cash flow problems that might explain Bob's desperation to access any available funds, including my savings and salary. My growing knowledge of Bob's business difficulties made his theft of my money even more disturbing, as it suggested that he had knowingly transferred his business risks to me without my consent or knowledge. The possibility that my carefully saved money was now tied up in legal disputes or used to pay overdue bills meant that recovery might be more complicated than simply demanding repayment from Bob personally. The emotional toll of living with someone who had stolen from me while pretending to be a caring stepfather became increasingly difficult to manage. Bob's continued presence at family dinners, his participation in household decisions, and his expectation that I would treat him with respect and affection created a surreal atmosphere where criminal behavior was disguised as normal family interaction. The cognitive dissonance of sharing meals with someone who was actively stealing from me was exhausting and demoralizing. Linda's inability to acknowledge the severity of Bob's actions, combined with her continued pressure for me to be more understanding and forgiving, created additional emotional strain that affected my work performance and personal relationships. Her suggestion that I should focus on rebuilding my savings rather than dwelling on what had already happened revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both the financial and emotional impact of Bob's theft. The approach of the holiday season brought additional pressure to maintain family harmony while dealing with the ongoing financial abuse. Bob's expectation that I would participate in family traditions and celebrations as if nothing had happened reflected his assumption that I would eventually accept his theft as a permanent fact rather than a problem that required resolution. His casual references to future family gatherings and shared expenses suggested that he viewed my money as a renewable resource that he could access whenever needed. Marcus's invitation to spend Thanksgiving with his family provided an escape from the toxic atmosphere of my own household, but also forced me to confront the contrast between healthy family relationships and the dysfunction I had been conditioned to accept as normal. The experience of being welcomed into a family where financial boundaries were respected and where generosity didn't come with strings attached was both healing and painful, highlighting everything that was wrong with my own family situation. My decision to accept Marcus's invitation rather than participate in our family's traditional Thanksgiving celebration marked the first time I had chosen my own well-being over Bob's expectations. His reaction to my absence was immediate and aggressive, with angry phone calls demanding explanations and accusations that I was being selfish and ungrateful. The intensity of his response revealed how much my compliance had meant to his sense of control and authority. The confrontation that followed my Thanksgiving absence escalated beyond previous arguments about money to encompass Bob's fundamental assumptions about my role in the family and my obligations to accept his decisions without question. His demand that I apologize for missing the family dinner and promise to be more cooperative in the future represented an ultimatum that would determine whether I could continue living in his house while pursuing recovery of my stolen money. Linda's role as mediator in this confrontation revealed the extent to which she prioritized Bob's comfort over my rights and well-being. Her suggestion that I could resolve the situation by acknowledging Bob's generosity and promising to be more appreciative demonstrated that she viewed my theft as a minor family disagreement rather than a serious crime that required accountability and restitution. The holiday shopping season provided additional opportunities to observe Bob's current financial situation and spending patterns. His reluctance to make the kind of expensive purchases that had characterized previous years suggested that his access to ready cash had become more limited. Ashley's disappointment when her Christmas gift requests were met with suggestions for more modest alternatives confirmed that Bob's financial circumstances had changed significantly since her wedding. My documentation of these changes in Bob's behavior and spending patterns added to the evidence Patricia Williams was accumulating for potential legal action. The contrast between Bob's lavish spending on Ashley's wedding and his current financial constraints supported the theory that my stolen money had been used to address business pressures rather than simply to indulge his daughter's desires. The year-end financial statements that Bob prepared for tax purposes provided additional insight into Chen Development's actual financial performance, though his reluctance to discuss business details with family members limited my access to specific information. However, his increased stress levels and longer working hours suggested that the company was facing challenges that required his constant attention and intervention. My research into the construction industry's current market conditions revealed that many companies similar to Chen Development were struggling with increased competition, rising material costs, and more stringent regulatory requirements. The economic pressures affecting the entire industry provided context for understanding Bob's financial difficulties, though they didn't excuse his decision to steal from me rather than address his business problems through legitimate means. The approaching new year brought pressure to make definitive decisions about how to proceed with recovering my stolen money and protecting myself from future theft. Patricia Williams had explained that delaying legal action much longer would compromise my options and potentially allow Bob to dissipate additional assets or create new complications. The choice between pursuing criminal charges and attempting to negotiate a private settlement was becoming unavoidable, regardless of my preference for finding a solution that wouldn't destroy family relationships. My growing understanding of Bob's business practices and financial situation had transformed my perspective on the theft from a personal betrayal to a symptom of larger problems that might have legal implications extending far beyond my stolen savings. The possibility that Bob's financial manipulations involved fraud, corruption, or other criminal activities meant that my decision about how to respond might have consequences that I hadn't initially anticipated. The emotional preparation required for taking legal action against a family member was as challenging as the practical considerations involved in building a case and pursuing prosecution. Everything I had been taught about family loyalty and conflict avoidance was in direct opposition to the steps necessary for protecting myself and recovering my stolen money. The choice between maintaining family harmony and defending my rights would determine not just my financial future but also my understanding of my own worth and my willingness to fight for the life I had worked so hard to build. The morning I walked into the Phoenix FBI field office with a banker's box full of evidence, I felt the weight of every decision that had brought me to this moment. Patricia Williams accompanied me to the meeting she had arranged with Agent Sarah Collins, a specialist in financial crimes who had experience prosecuting cases involving wire fraud and embezzlement. The federal building's imposing architecture seemed designed to remind visitors of the serious consequences that awaited those who violated federal law, and I wondered if Bob had any idea that his theft of my savings had crossed into territory that could result in federal prosecution. Agent Collins reviewed my documentation with the methodical precision of someone who had seen countless cases of financial manipulation and family betrayal. The paper trail I had assembled over months of careful record-keeping told a clear story of systematic theft that extended far beyond the original wedding fund raid. Bob's unauthorized access to my accounts, his fabricated justifications for taking my money, and his escalating pattern of financial control created a compelling case for wire fraud prosecution. The banking records that Patricia had subpoenaed revealed the full scope of Bob's financial manipulations, including transfers that I hadn't been aware of during the months when I was focused on documenting the obvious thefts. Agent Collins explained that Bob had been moving money between multiple accounts in ways that suggested an attempt to obscure the source and destination of funds, a pattern consistent with money laundering rather than simple family financial management. The investigation that Agent Collins initiated extended far beyond my stolen savings to encompass Chen Development's business practices and Bob's relationships with city officials and regulatory authorities. Federal investigators had apparently been monitoring unusual patterns in Phoenix construction contracts for months, and my complaint provided the evidence they needed to justify a comprehensive investigation into Bob's activities. The discovery that Bob's theft of my money was connected to a larger pattern of fraud and corruption was simultaneously validating and overwhelming. Agent Collins explained that my savings had likely been used to pay bribes to city officials who expedited permits and approvals for Chen Development projects, making me an unwitting participant in a conspiracy that involved multiple federal crimes. The realization that my carefully saved money had funded corruption rather than Ashley's wedding made Bob's betrayal even more devastating. The federal investigation moved with frightening speed once it began in earnest. Agent Collins explained that financial crimes cases often required quick action to prevent suspects from destroying evidence or transferring assets beyond the reach of law enforcement. Within days of my initial complaint, federal agents had executed search warrants on Bob's home office, Chen Development's headquarters, and several city offices where Bob conducted business. The search of our Scottsdale home was surreal and traumatic, as federal agents methodically photographed and collected evidence from Bob's personal files while my mother watched in shock and disbelief. Linda's reaction to the FBI raid revealed that she had been completely unaware of the extent of Bob's illegal activities, and her desperate attempts to explain away the evidence as misunderstandings or accounting errors were painful to witness. Bob's arrest at Chen Development's offices was witnessed by employees and subcontractors who had considered him a successful and respected businessman. The charges that Agent Collins read during his booking included wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit bribery, and theft of federal funds, allegations that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. The contrast between Bob's confident public persona and his appearance in handcuffs being led away by federal agents was stark and satisfying. Ashley and Tyler's return from their extended honeymoon coincided with news reports about Bob's arrest and the federal investigation into construction industry corruption in Phoenix. Their shock at discovering that Ashley's dream wedding had been funded by criminal proceeds was genuine and heartbreaking as they realized that their marriage had been built on a foundation of fraud and theft. Tyler's immediate concern about his own reputation and career prospects revealed that their relationship might not survive the scandal that Bob's crimes had created. The media coverage of Bob's arrest and the broader investigation into Phoenix construction corruption was extensive and damaging to everyone associated with Chen Development. Local news stations featured stories about the elaborate wedding that had been funded by stolen money and corrupt practices, using photos from Ashley's social media posts to illustrate the lavish lifestyle that federal prosecutors alleged was built on criminal proceeds. My decision to cooperate fully with the federal investigation meant testifying before a grand jury about Bob's theft of my savings and his pattern of financial control and manipulation. The experience of describing my family's dysfunction to a room full of strangers was humiliating but necessary, as my testimony provided the personal context that transformed abstract financial crimes into a story about real victims and genuine harm. The grand jury's decision to indict Bob on multiple federal charges validated my decision to seek justice rather than accept his theft as an unfortunate family situation. Agent Collins explained that the indictment represented one of the most comprehensive prosecutions of construction industry corruption that federal authorities had
pursued in Arizona, with Bob's case serving as the foundation for additional charges against city officials and other contractors who had participated in the bribery scheme. Linda's loyalty to Bob throughout the investigation and prosecution was both admirable and frustrating, as she continued to insist that the charges were based on misunderstandings, and that federal prosecutors were persecuting a successful businessman out of jealousy or political motivation. Her inability to acknowledge Bob's crimes, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, demonstrated how completely she had internalized his manipulation and control. The asset forfeiture proceedings that accompanied Bob's criminal prosecution resulted in the seizure of our Scottsdale home, his luxury vehicles, and most of the expensive possessions that had symbolized his success and generosity. Linda's displacement from the lifestyle she had enjoyed for years was painful to witness, even though her financial difficulties were the direct result of Bob's criminal activities rather than any action I had taken. My recovery of the stolen savings through the federal restitution process was complicated by the fact that my money had been commingled with criminal proceeds from Bob's bribery scheme. Agent Collins explained that recovering stolen funds in federal cases often took months or years, as prosecutors needed to trace the movement of money through multiple accounts and transactions before determining how much each victim was entitled to receive. The psychological impact of Bob's betrayal and the subsequent federal investigation was more severe than I had anticipated, requiring therapy to process the trauma of discovering that my family life had been built on criminal activity. The realization that my stepfather had viewed me as a resource to be exploited rather than a family member to be protected challenged everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and family obligation. Marcus's support throughout the investigation and prosecution was unwavering, though the stress of dating someone whose family was involved in a federal criminal case created challenges that tested our relationship. His willingness to stand by me during the most difficult period of my life demonstrated the kind of genuine love and loyalty that I had been seeking from my family without realizing it. The plea negotiations that Bob's attorneys initiated revealed the full scope of his criminal activities and the potential sentences he faced if convicted at trial. Federal prosecutors offered reduced charges in exchange for Bob's cooperation in prosecuting city officials and other contractors who had participated in the bribery scheme, but even the reduced sentences would likely result in years of federal imprisonment. Bob's decision to accept a plea agreement rather than fight the charges at trial was motivated partly by his desire to minimize Linda's financial exposure and partly by his recognition that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The allocution hearing where Bob admitted his guilt was the first time he had publicly acknowledged wrongdoing, though his statements to the court focused on accepting responsibility rather than expressing genuine remorse for the harm he had caused. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for me to address the court about the impact of Bob's crimes on my life and future plans. My victim impact statement described not just the financial devastation he had caused, but also the emotional trauma of discovering that someone I had trusted and respected had viewed me as a source of funds for his criminal activities. Bob's sentence of 4 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release was less than the maximum he could have received, but sufficient to demonstrate that his crimes had serious consequences. The restitution order that accompanied his sentence required him to pay back not just my stolen savings but also penalties and interest that would take years to satisfy even if he found legitimate employment after his release. Ashley and Tyler's divorce was finalized while Bob was serving his federal sentence as Tyler's career in pharmaceutical sales couldn't survive the association with federal corruption charges. Ashley's transition from pampered princess to single woman facing financial reality was difficult but ultimately beneficial as she was forced to develop independence and work ethic that Bob's indulgence had prevented her from acquiring. Linda's adjustment to life without Bob's financial support was complicated by her continued loyalty to him and her resentment toward me for initiating the investigation that had destroyed her comfortable lifestyle. Our relationship remained strained throughout Bob's imprisonment as she struggled to accept that his crimes were real rather than fabrications created by overzealous federal prosecutors. My purchase of the house in Tempe using my recovered savings plus the accumulated interest and penalties felt like justice finally served, though the victory was tempered by the knowledge of how much pain and trauma had been required to achieve it. The little craftsman home with its original hardwood floors and garden space represented not just financial independence but also freedom from the manipulation and control that had characterized my family relationships. The career advancement that followed my escape from Bob's financial abuse included a promotion to charge nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital. My colleagues' respect for my resilience during the federal investigation and my dedication to patient care despite personal challenges created opportunities for leadership that might not have been available if I had remained trapped in my family's dysfunction. Marcus's proposal came 2 years after Bob's sentencing in the garden of my Tempe home where I had finally achieved the independence and security that Bob's theft had temporarily derailed. Our wedding was a small celebration focused on genuine love and mutual respect rather than expensive displays designed to impress others, reflecting values that were fundamentally different from the materialism and manipulation that had characterized my family life. The federal investigation's broader impact on Phoenix's construction industry resulted in additional prosecutions and reforms designed to prevent the kind of corruption that Bob had practiced for years. Agent Collins explained that my decision to report Bob's theft had contributed to cleaning up practices that had cost taxpayers millions of dollars and undermined public trust in government institutions. Bob's release from federal prison after serving 3.5 years of his sentence was accompanied by continued financial obligations and restrictions that limited his ability to return to the construction business. His attempts to rebuild relationships with Ashley and Linda were complicated by their ongoing resentment about the consequences his crimes had created for their own lives. My decision to maintain no contact with Bob after his release was based on advice from my therapist and my own recognition that forgiveness didn't require me to subject myself to continued manipulation or abuse. The boundaries I had learned to establish during his imprisonment protected the life I had built without him and ensured that his return to freedom wouldn't compromise my own security and well-being. Ashley's eventual success as a real estate agent in Phoenix demonstrated that she was capable of building meaningful accomplishments when forced to rely on her own efforts rather than Bob's financial support. Our relationship remained distant but cordial as we both understood that our different responses to Bob's crimes had created a permanent division between us. Linda's gradual acceptance of Bob's guilt and the legitimacy of my decision to report his crimes took several years to develop but eventually led to a tentative reconciliation that allowed us to maintain limited contact without revisiting the painful events that had torn our family apart. Her acknowledgement that I had been right to seek justice rather than accept theft as a family obligation represented significant personal growth for someone who had spent years prioritizing harmony over truth. The financial security and independence that my recovered savings provided became the foundation for additional investments and planning that ensured Bob's crimes would never again threaten my future.
The lessons I learned about protecting myself from financial manipulation informed every subsequent decision about money, relationships, and family obligations. My work with other victims of financial abuse through a support group at the local women's center provided an opportunity to help others recognize and escape the kind of manipulation I had experienced. Sharing my story with people facing similar situations demonstrated that resistance was possible and that seeking help was strength rather than disloyalty. The federal restitution payments that continued to arrive monthly served as regular reminders that justice had been served and that my decision to report Bob's crimes had been vindicated. The additional money beyond my original savings represented compensation for the trauma and disruption his theft had caused, though no amount could fully restore the trust and security that his betrayal had destroyed. Years after Bob's sentencing, I received occasional updates about his efforts to rebuild his life and business relationships but maintained the boundaries that protected me from his continued attempts at manipulation and control. The peace and stability I had achieved through cutting contact with toxic family members was worth more than any relationship built on obligation rather than genuine affection and respect. The house in Tempe that had represented my dreams before Bob's theft became the symbol of my recovery and independence, a daily reminder that careful planning and hard work could overcome even the most serious betrayals. The garden where I grew vegetables and the rooms I had painted in colors that reflected my personality rather than someone else's preferences represented freedom that could never again be taken away by family members who prioritized their own interests over my well-being. My marriage to Marcus and our eventual decision to start a family created the loving relationships I had been seeking throughout my struggles with Bob's financial abuse. The values we shared about money, respect, and mutual support provided the foundation for building something meaningful together rather than simply enduring dysfunction disguised as family loyalty. The story of my family's financial crimes and federal prosecution became part of Phoenix's local history, a cautionary tale about the corruption that could flourish when oversight was inadequate and consequences were avoided. My role in exposing Bob's crimes contributed to reforms that benefited the entire community, transforming personal trauma into public service. The financial education and independence I achieved through surviving Bob's theft and the subsequent investigation provided tools and confidence that enhanced every aspect of my life. The knowledge that I could protect myself from manipulation and build security through my own efforts created opportunities for risk-taking and growth that would have been impossible if I had remained trapped in dysfunctional family relationships. Looking back on the years of Bob's financial abuse and the federal investigation that followed, I understood that my decision to seek justice rather than accept theft had been the most important choice of my adult life. The courage required to challenge family loyalty in favor of personal integrity had been painful but necessary for building the life I deserved. The ongoing impact of my experience with financial abuse informed my approach to helping others recognize and escape similar situations. The support group I facilitated and the advocacy work I pursued represented my commitment to ensuring that other victims would have the resources and encouragement needed to seek justice rather than suffer in silence. Agent Collins's explanation that financial crimes prosecutions often depended on victims willing to come forward and testify helped me understand the broader significance of my decision to report Bob's theft. The justice system's ability to address corruption and protect future victims required people like me to choose difficult confrontation over comfortable denial. The annual victim impact statements I submitted during Bob's supervised release period served as regular reminders that his crimes had lasting consequences and that accountability was ongoing rather than limited to his prison sentence. The federal probation system's monitoring of his financial activities provided some assurance that he wouldn't easily victimize others in the same way he had stolen from me. The transformation that began with Bob's federal conviction extended far beyond my personal recovery to encompass changes in how Phoenix handled construction contracts and regulatory oversight. Agent Collins invited me to testify before a congressional subcommittee investigating corruption in federal infrastructure projects, an opportunity to share my story with lawmakers who had the power to prevent similar crimes from affecting other families. The experience of addressing members of Congress about how my stolen savings had funded a bribery scheme was simultaneously intimidating and empowering, representing the ultimate validation of my decision to seek justice rather than accept theft as a family obligation. The congressional testimony brought national attention to the Phoenix construction corruption case and my role in exposing it, resulting in interview requests from news organizations and documentary filmmakers interested in exploring how family financial abuse connected to broader patterns of institutional corruption. While I was initially reluctant to share such personal details with strangers, I gradually understood that my story could help other victims recognize their situations and seek appropriate help. The documentary that eventually featured my case, titled Blood Money: When Family Becomes the Enemy, was broadcast on a major network and reached millions of viewers who might never have understood the connection between personal financial abuse and public corruption. The producers handled my story with sensitivity and accuracy, focusing on the broader implications of Bob's crimes rather than sensationalizing the family drama that had made those crimes possible. My appearance on national television generated thousands of emails and messages from viewers who had experienced similar financial abuse by family members, many of whom had never considered that their situations might constitute crimes worthy of prosecution. The overwhelming response demonstrated that Bob's theft of my savings was part of a much larger pattern of family financial abuse that affected people across all economic and social backgrounds. The victim advocacy organization that I eventually founded, called Financial Justice Alliance, grew from my informal support group work to become a nationally recognized resource for people dealing with family financial abuse and fraud. The organization's hotline, legal referral service, and educational materials helped thousands of victims understand their rights and options for seeking restitution and accountability. Working with other financial abuse survivors revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that typically accompanied such crimes, as perpetrators worked to convince victims that theft was actually generosity and that resistance represented ingratitude rather than legitimate self-protection. The patterns I identified through this advocacy work informed training programs for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and victim services providers who needed to understand the unique challenges faced by family financial abuse victims. The research that Financial Justice Alliance sponsored demonstrated that family financial abuse was significantly underreported and prosecuted far less frequently than similar crimes committed by strangers, partly because victims struggled to recognize their situations as criminal rather than simply dysfunctional. The data we collected helped justify increased funding for investigation and prosecution of these crimes, as well as enhanced protection for victims who chose to seek justice. Marcus's support for my advocacy work was unwavering, even when it required extensive travel and time away from our growing family. His understanding that my work was both personally healing and socially valuable demonstrated the kind of genuine partnership that I had been seeking throughout my struggles with Bob's financial manipulation. Our marriage provided a daily example of what healthy relationships looked like when built on mutual respect rather than control and exploitation. The birth of our daughter Emma 5 years after Bob's conviction brought new perspective to my understanding of family relationships and the responsibility that parents have to protect their children's financial security and independence. Holding my newborn daughter while knowing that I would never steal from her or manipulate her financial decisions provided closure for some of the trauma that Bob's betrayal had created. Ashley's gradual transformation from entitled princess to independent professional was one of the unexpected positive outcomes of Bob's conviction and imprisonment. Her success in real estate sales demonstrated capabilities that Bob's indulgence had prevented her from developing, and our eventual reconciliation was built on mutual respect rather than the competitive dynamic that had characterized our relationship during her father's reign of financial manipulation. The real estate expertise that Ashley developed helped me make informed decisions about property investments that grew my recovered savings into substantial wealth over time. Her professional advice was motivated by genuine desire to help rather than obligation or manipulation, representing the kind of family relationship that could exist when power dynamics were healthy and boundaries were respected. Linda's evolution from Bob's enabler to someone who could acknowledge his crimes and support my decisions took years to complete, but eventually resulted in a grandmother relationship with Emma that was built on honest communication rather than the denial and manipulation that had characterized our family interactions during Bob's criminal period. Her ability to learn from the trauma that Bob's crimes had caused demonstrated that people could change when motivated by genuine love rather than fear of conflict. Bob's attempts to contact me after his release from federal prison were consistently declined, as I had learned that maintaining boundaries with manipulative people required absolute consistency rather than occasional exceptions based on guilt or family pressure. The letters he sent through intermediaries revealed that he continued to view himself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach rather than someone who had committed serious crimes against his own family. The ongoing financial monitoring that accompanied Bob's supervised release provided some assurance that he wouldn't easily return to the patterns of fraud and theft that had characterized his previous business practices. Federal probation officers required detailed accounting of all income and expenses, making it difficult for him to hide money or engage in the kind of cash transactions that had facilitated his previous crimes. Chen Development's bankruptcy and dissolution during Bob's imprisonment eliminated any possibility that he could resume his construction business under the same corporate structure that had facilitated his bribery scheme.
The company's assets were liquidated to pay creditors and victims, with the proceeds contributing to the restitution fund that continued to provide monthly payments to me and other victims of Bob's fraud. The city officials who had accepted bribes from Bob faced their own prosecutions and consequences, including prison sentences, financial penalties, and permanent bans from government employment. The comprehensive nature of the federal investigation ensured that the corruption network Bob had built was completely dismantled rather than simply disrupted temporarily. The regulatory reforms that followed the Phoenix construction corruption scandal included enhanced oversight of permit processes, mandatory disclosure of political contributions and business relationships, and stricter penalties for officials who accepted improper payments or favors. These changes made it more difficult for future Bob Chens to build the kind of corrupt networks that had enabled his crimes against both his family and the public. My testimony and subsequent corruption cases involving other contractors and officials helped prosecutors understand the personal impact of public corruption and the connections between individual crimes and broader patterns of institutional abuse. The expertise I developed about financial crime investigation and prosecution led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies across the country. The scholarship fund that Financial Justice Alliance established helped victims of family financial abuse pursue education and career development that could provide independence and security after escaping abusive situations. The recipients' success stories demonstrated that recovery from financial trauma was possible when victims received appropriate support and resources. The legislative advocacy that grew from my work with Financial Justice Alliance resulted in stronger laws protecting victims of family financial abuse and enhanced penalties for perpetrators who exploited family relationships to commit theft and fraud. The bills that passed in several states were often called Jessica's Laws in recognition of my role in bringing attention to these crimes. Marcus's promotion to Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Mary's Hospital provided additional financial security that allowed me to dedicate more time to advocacy work without worrying about our family's economic stability. His professional success was built on merit and dedication rather than the corruption and manipulation that had characterized Bob's business achievements. The investment portfolio that grew from my recovered savings provided passive income that supplemented my advocacy work and ensured that Bob's crimes would never again threaten my financial security. The knowledge that I had built wealth through legitimate means rather than theft or corruption was profoundly satisfying and represented the ultimate triumph over Bob's attempts to control my financial destiny. Emma's childhood was deliberately structured to include age-appropriate education about money, boundaries, and the difference between healthy family relationships and manipulative behavior. My determination to raise her with financial literacy and self-protection skills reflected my commitment to ensuring that she would never experience the kind of exploitation that Bob had inflicted on me. The periodic updates I received about Bob's post-prison life revealed ongoing struggles to find legitimate employment and rebuild relationships with family members who continued to blame him for the consequences of his crimes. His inability to accept full responsibility for his actions suggested that the personality traits that had enabled his criminal behavior remained largely unchanged by his federal conviction and imprisonment. Tyler's new marriage to someone who understood his history with Ashley and the Chen family scandal demonstrated that people could move forward from traumatic experiences when they were honest about their past and committed to building healthier relationships. His success in pharmaceutical sales continued despite the temporary setback caused by his association with Bob's crimes. The annual victim impact statements that I continued to submit during Bob's supervised release served multiple purposes beyond simply documenting ongoing harm, including education for probation officers about the lasting effects of financial crimes and advocacy for policies that better protected victims' rights and interests. Agent Collins's retirement from the FBI was marked by recognition for her work on financial crimes cases, including the Phoenix construction corruption investigation that had grown from my initial complaint about stolen savings. Her explanation that my case had been particularly significant because it demonstrated the personal impact of public corruption helped me understand the broader importance of my decision to seek justice. The speaking engagements that became a regular part of my advocacy work took me to conferences, universities, and community organizations across the country where I shared my story with audiences who needed to understand the realities of family financial abuse. The positive response to these presentations demonstrated that education could prevent crimes by helping people recognize warning signs and understand their options for protection. The book that I eventually wrote about my experience with family financial abuse and federal prosecution became a bestseller and generated additional resources for Financial Justice Alliance's programs and services. The royalties from book sales provided sustainable funding for victim services while ensuring that my story continued to reach people who needed to understand that resistance to financial abuse was possible and necessary.
The media training that accompanied my book tour and advocacy work helped me develop skills for effectively communicating complex ideas about financial crime and victim rights to diverse audiences. The ability to translate my personal experience into broader lessons about justice and accountability became valuable for policy advocacy and public education efforts. Emma's questions about why Grandpa Bob wasn't part of our family provided opportunities to discuss concepts of right and wrong, consequences for harmful behavior, and the importance of protecting oneself from people who would cause harm regardless of family relationships. These conversations were challenging but necessary for ensuring that she understood the values that guided our family's decisions. The counseling and therapy that I continued long after Bob's conviction helped me process not just the trauma of his financial abuse but also the complex feelings associated with achieving justice and rebuilding my life. The ongoing psychological support was essential for maintaining the boundaries and self-protection skills that prevented future victimization. The mentorship relationships that I developed with younger advocates and crime victims provided opportunities to share practical knowledge about navigating the criminal justice system and building life after trauma. The satisfaction of helping others achieve justice and independence was profoundly meaningful and represented positive transformation of my negative experiences. The academic research that studied my case and others like it contributed to scholarly understanding of family financial abuse and informed development of more effective prevention and intervention strategies. The collaboration with researchers from universities across the country helped ensure that lessons learned from individual cases were translated into broader knowledge that could benefit future victims. The international attention that my
story eventually received led to speaking invitations from organizations in other countries where family financial abuse was recognized as a significant social problem requiring systematic responses. The opportunity to share American approaches to investigation and prosecution with international audiences demonstrated that the principles of justice and victim protection were universal rather than culturally specific. The legacy that I hoped to create through my advocacy work was a world where family financial abuse was recognized as serious crime rather than private family matter, where victims received appropriate support and protection, and where perpetrators faced meaningful consequences regardless of their relationships to their victims. The progress that Financial Justice Alliance and similar organizations had achieved suggested that this goal was realistic rather than idealistic. The reflection that came with years of distance from Bob's crimes and their aftermath revealed that my decision to seek justice rather than accept theft had been transformative not just for me personally but for countless other victims who benefited from the legal precedents, policy changes, and social awareness that resulted from my case. The courage that had seemed so difficult to summon in those early days of documentation and decision-making had created ripple effects that extended far beyond my own recovery and success. The gratitude that I felt for Agent Collins, Patricia Williams, Marcus, and the many other people who had supported my journey from victim to advocate was balanced by recognition that my own determination and refusal to accept injustice had been equally important for achieving positive outcomes. The combination of personal strength and community support had made justice possible in ways that neither element could have accomplished alone. The continuing work of Financial Justice Alliance and the ongoing impact of the congressional testimony, documentary, and book that had grown from my experience with Bob's crimes demonstrated that individual decisions to seek justice could have lasting effects on society's understanding of right and wrong. The choice between accepting family dysfunction and demanding accountability had implications that extended far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass broader questions of justice and social responsibility. The 10-year anniversary of Bob's arrest brought unexpected reflection on how completely my life had transformed from the devastated young nurse who had discovered her savings stolen to the nationally recognized advocate who now addressed audiences of thousands about financial justice and family accountability. The commemorative event that Financial Justice Alliance organized brought together victims, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and advocates from across the country to celebrate the progress that had been made in recognizing and addressing family financial abuse as a serious crime rather than a private matter. Agent Collins, now retired but still passionate about financial crime prevention, delivered the keynote address at the anniversary celebration, describing how my initial complaint about stolen wedding funds had evolved into one of the most comprehensive corruption investigations in federal law enforcement history. Her presentation included statistics showing that prosecutions of family financial abuse had increased dramatically in the years following Bob's conviction, with my case serving as a template for how such crimes could be effectively investigated and prosecuted. The survivor speakers who shared their stories at the anniversary event represented diverse backgrounds and circumstances, but all had been inspired by my example to seek justice rather than accept theft and manipulation by family members.
Their accounts of recovery and empowerment demonstrated that the courage to challenge family dysfunction could transform individual lives while creating broader social change that benefited entire communities. Marcus's introduction of me as the evening's final speaker included details about our family life that audiences rarely heard, describing how the woman who had fought federal corruption charges was also a devoted mother who coached our daughter's soccer team and volunteered at local schools. His perspective as my husband provided insight into the personal cost of advocacy work and the ongoing healing required to maintain healthy relationships after experiencing profound family betrayal. Emma, now 10 years old and attending the anniversary event for the first time, listened with remarkable maturity as I described the events that had shaped our family's values and priorities. Her questions afterward revealed sophisticated understanding of concepts like justice, accountability, and the difference between family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior, reflecting the deliberate way we had approached her education about these complex moral issues. The research presentation that Dr. Robert Chen from Arizona State University delivered at the anniversary event summarized findings from the longitudinal study that had followed my case and dozens of others over the past decade. The data showed that victims who pursued legal action against family financial abusers had significantly better long-term outcomes in terms of financial recovery, psychological health, and relationship satisfaction compared to those who chose to endure abuse silently. The policy panel that concluded the anniversary event included state legislators, federal prosecutors, and advocacy leaders who discussed the legal reforms that had been implemented since Bob's conviction and the additional changes needed to better protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable. The unanimous consensus was that my decision to speak publicly about family financial abuse had fundamentally changed how society understood these crimes and responded to victims who sought help. The international delegation that attended the anniversary event represented countries where family financial abuse was beginning to be recognized as a serious social problem requiring systematic legal and social responses. Their questions about investigation techniques, victim services, and prevention programs demonstrated that the lessons learned from my case had applications far beyond American borders and could inform global efforts to address these crimes. The technology demonstration that Financial Justice Alliance unveiled at the anniversary event included a new mobile app that helped potential victims document suspicious financial activity, locate legal resources, and connect with support services in their area. The development of this tool reflected how advocacy organizations had evolved to use modern technology for prevention and intervention rather than simply responding to crimes after they occurred. The corporate sponsorship that supported the anniversary event came from financial institutions, technology companies, and professional organizations that had implemented policies and training programs based on lessons learned from my case and others like it. Their participation demonstrated that private sector entities understood their responsibility to help prevent and address financial abuse rather than simply profit from the transactions that facilitated such crimes. The media coverage of the anniversary event reached audiences who might never have heard my story through traditional advocacy channels, with interviews and feature articles appearing in mainstream publications that typically didn't focus on financial crime or victim advocacy. The broad reach of this coverage reflected how my case had transcended its origins as a family dispute to become a symbol of resistance to corruption and abuse at all levels of society. The scholarship recipients who spoke at the anniversary event included young adults who had used Financial Justice Alliance grants to pursue education and career development after escaping family financial abuse. Their achievements in fields ranging from law and medicine to business and social work demonstrated that recovery from financial trauma could lead to extraordinary personal and professional success when victims received appropriate support. The law enforcement training program that had grown from collaboration between Financial Justice Alliance and federal agencies was highlighted at the anniversary event through testimonials from officers and agents who had successfully investigated and prosecuted family financial abuse cases using techniques developed from my experience with Bob's crimes. The standardized protocols and investigative tools that resulted from this collaboration had improved outcomes for victims across the country. The Victim Services Coordination Network that connected advocacy organizations, legal aid societies, and social service agencies was celebrated at the anniversary event as an example of how my case had inspired systemic changes that benefited all victims of family abuse rather than just those dealing with financial crimes. The integrated approach to victim support that resulted from this network had become a model for other regions and crime types. The academic curriculum that several universities had developed based on my case and the broader research it had inspired was presented at the anniversary event as evidence of how individual stories could become teaching tools that educated future professionals about the complexities of family abuse and the importance of victim-centered approaches to justice. The textbooks and case studies that featured my experience ensured that lessons learned from Bob's crimes would continue to educate students for years to come. The legislative victories that advocacy organizations had achieved in the decades since Bob's conviction were summarized at the anniversary event through presentations by state and federal lawmakers who had sponsored bills strengthening penalties for family financial abuse and expanding victim protections. The bipartisan support for these measures demonstrated that my story had resonated across political divides and created consensus around the need for stronger responses to these crimes. The international conference that Financial Justice Alliance announced at the anniversary event would bring together advocates, researchers, and policymakers from around the world to share strategies for preventing and addressing family financial abuse in different cultural and legal contexts. The global scope of this initiative reflected how my individual experience with Bob's theft had evolved into a worldwide movement for financial justice and family accountability. The documentary series that a major streaming platform was developing based on my case and others featured in Financial Justice Alliance's work promised to reach millions of viewers who might recognize their own situations in the stories being told. The producers' commitment to accuracy and sensitivity in portraying family financial abuse demonstrated how entertainment media could serve educational and advocacy purposes when handled responsibly. The research grants that Financial Justice Alliance was awarding to universities and advocacy organizations would fund studies exploring prevention strategies, intervention techniques, and long-term recovery support for victims of family financial abuse. The investment in evidence-based research reflected the organization's evolution from a support group into a sophisticated advocacy and research institution that influenced policy and practice at national and international levels. The mentorship program that connected experienced advocates with newer victims and survivors was expanding beyond Financial Justice Alliance to include partnerships with other organizations serving different types of abuse survivors. The recognition that family financial abuse shared characteristics with other forms of domestic violence and exploitation had led to collaborative approaches that benefited all victims regardless of the specific nature of their experiences. The corporate compliance program that Financial Justice Alliance was developing with major financial institutions would help banks and credit unions identify potential signs of family financial abuse and connect suspected victims with appropriate resources. The partnership with private sector entities represented acknowledgement that preventing these crimes required cooperation between advocacy organizations, law enforcement, and the businesses that facilitated financial transactions. The speaker bureau that had grown from my individual advocacy work now included dozens of survivors who shared their stories at conferences, universities, and community events across the country. The diversity of voices and experiences represented in this group demonstrated that family financial abuse affected people from all backgrounds and that recovery and empowerment were possible regardless of the specific circumstances involved. The annual report that Financial Justice Alliance released at the anniversary event documented the organization's growth from a small support group into a national advocacy organization with offices in 12 states and partnerships with international organizations in 15 countries. The statistics showing thousands of victims served, hundreds of successful prosecutions, and dozens of policy changes demonstrated the tangible impact that had grown from my decision to seek justice rather than accept Bob's theft. The technology partnerships that Financial Justice Alliance had developed with cybersecurity companies and financial technology firms were creating new tools for preventing and detecting family financial abuse in an increasingly digital economy. The recognition that traditional forms of financial manipulation were evolving to include cryptocurrency, online banking, and digital payment systems had prompted development of more sophisticated prevention and intervention strategies. The training materials that Financial Justice Alliance had created for victim services providers, law enforcement officers, and legal professionals were being used by organizations across the country to improve their responses to family financial abuse cases. The standardized curricula and assessment tools that resulted from this work ensured that victims received consistent, high-quality support regardless of their geographic location or the specific agencies involved in their cases. The peer support network that connected family financial abuse survivors across the country had become a model for other advocacy organizations serving different types of crime victims. The recognition that survivors often provided the most effective support and advocacy for others facing similar situations had led to structured programs that harnessed this expertise while providing appropriate training and oversight. The prevention campaigns that Financial Justice Alliance was launching in schools, community centers, and online platforms aimed to educate people about healthy financial boundaries and family relationships before abuse occurred. The focus on prevention rather than simply responding to crimes after they happened represented a mature approach to addressing family financial abuse that could reduce victimization rates over time. The policy research that Financial Justice Alliance was conducting in partnership with academic institutions was generating evidence about the most effective legal and social responses to family financial abuse. The findings from this research were informing legislative proposals, law enforcement training, and victim services programming across the country, ensuring that advocacy efforts were grounded in solid evidence rather than good intentions alone. The international symposium that would mark the anniversary celebration's conclusion would bring together survivors, advocates, researchers, and policymakers from around the world to share experiences and develop collaborative strategies for addressing family financial abuse across different cultural and legal contexts. The global scope of this gathering reflected how my individual story had become part of a worldwide movement for financial justice and family accountability. Emma's participation in the anniversary celebration as both audience member and junior volunteer demonstrated how the next generation was learning about justice, advocacy, and social responsibility through direct involvement in meaningful work. Her comfort with the concepts and language of victim advocacy reflected the deliberate way we had approached her education about these issues while ensuring that her childhood remained normal and joyful despite the serious nature of our family's history. The recognition ceremony that concluded the anniversary event honored the many people who had contributed to the progress achieved since Bob's conviction, including law enforcement officers, prosecutors, legislators, researchers, advocates, and survivors who had chosen to share their stories publicly. The diversity of contributors acknowledged that creating social change required collaboration across many different sectors and roles rather than relying on individual heroes or isolated efforts. The commitment ceremony that ended the anniversary celebration involved renewed pledges from advocacy organizations, law enforcement agencies, academic institutions, and corporate partners to continue working together to prevent family financial abuse and support survivors in their recovery and empowerment. The formal nature of these commitments reflected the maturity of the movement that had grown from my individual decision to seek justice rather than accept theft and manipulation. The personal reflection that I shared as the final speaker at the anniversary event acknowledged both the costs and benefits of choosing public advocacy over private healing, recognizing that my decision to tell my story had created opportunities to help others while also requiring ongoing vulnerability and re-traumatization. The honest assessment of advocacy work's challenges provided realistic expectations for other survivors considering whether to share their experiences publicly. The vision statement that Financial Justice Alliance adopted at the anniversary event outlined goals for the next decade of work, including prevention programs that would reduce victimization rates, intervention strategies that would improve outcomes for current victims, and policy changes that would strengthen legal protections and accountability measures. The ambitious but achievable objectives reflected the organization's evolution from crisis response to comprehensive social change advocacy. The legacy planning that occupied much of the anniversary event's business sessions focused on ensuring that the progress achieved through my case and others would continue regardless of changes in leadership, funding, or political priorities. The institutional development that had transformed Financial Justice Alliance from a personal mission into a sustainable organization demonstrated that individual stories could create lasting change when properly supported and systematically developed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.